Good afternoon and welcome. It's a delight to welcome you here. I begin, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this university stands, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay respects to elders past and present. My name is Glenn Davis. I'm the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. It is a great delight to welcome you all to the Kenneth Myer Building for this evening's launch of a very important research initiative. It's a particular pleasure to welcome back to campus, the Minister for Small Business, Innovation and Trade, Adem Somyurek. Adem, welcome. And thank him for making time or including us in what is a very busy schedule. I'd also like to acknowledge one of the Minister's important colleagues, the Member for Broadmeadows and the Parliamentary Secretary for Medical Research, Frank Maguire. Frank, it's lovely to see you here this afternoon as well. Thank you for joining us. And thank you to our distinguished panel. It's wonderful to see you here. Vishnadal, the Chief Technology Officer at Telstra, Pina Ledden, who heads the Communications, Media and Data Retention Practice at Gilbert and Tobin, John Stanton, the CEO of Communications Alliance, and of course, Taz. Welcome. It's lovely to see you here. A big welcome to colleagues from across the university and from the many supporters of this centre. Can I particularly acknowledge Taz, Nira Lamatas, the Director of the Melbourne Networked Society Initiative, and Taz does a great job leading this institute, and we're delighted to see you tonight. We launched tonight the Melbourne Network Society Institute, an initiative that harnesses the energy of world-class research and puts it at the service of the wider state and nation. But it's a service that focuses on a really important question. How can society take advantage of networks and connectivity to improve the quality of life, of our efficiency and our sustainability? It's a deep question, it's a timely one, and we're going to hear some more about it today. The idea of connectivity is now ubiquitous, is quite extraordinary. One estimate by Cisco put the number of connected devices on the planet at 14 billion. Likely to increase to 50 billion in the next 5 years. That's just extraordinary. That's change on a scale that we just don't see across the world. And this Network Society Institute is about focusing on those questions and what they will mean. It's great interdisciplinary work, which makes it a lot of fun. And it builds on the brilliant work of the Institute for a Broadband-Enabled Society. And I'm so pleased that the founding director of the Institute, Professor Rod Tucker, in fact, Emeritus Professor, as he sadly now is, Rod Tucker is here this evening. Rod, it's lovely to see you back, as always. Thank you. And thank you for the work that we now build on tonight. It's been hugely important. IBIS has seen over 200 researchers at this university, about 100 researchers from industry, from government, from other universities in the non-profit sector, forming a research community focused around these questions. IBIS seeded 93 research projects, supported 25 PhD students all the way through to graduation, and generated over 200 research publications and a huge amount of valuable research work with other partners. And it's from IBIS that today the Melbourne Network Society Institute becomes, we think, a critical asset for this university. And the presence of the Minister is particularly welcome. It highlights the vision, the ideas and the research that informed this institute. Before the election of the Andrews government last year, Minister Somyurek served for 4 years as the Shadow Minister for Manufacturing, Technology and Electoral Reform. He's also served in the Legislative Council of the Victorian Parliament since 2006. With the election of the present Victorian government, Minister Somyurek became the Victorian Minister for Small Business, Innovation and Trade, a portfolio of huge significance to the future of a network society in this state. It's a great delight to welcome him this evening and to invite Minister Adem Somyurek to speak to us. Minister.
Thank you. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which this event is taking place and pay my respects to their elders and the elders of all Victoria's Aboriginal communities. To Professor Glyn Davis, Vice-Chancellor, University of Melbourne, to Professor Taz Mirmalathas, Director, Melbourne Network Society Institute, to Mr Vish Nandlao, Chief Technology Officer at Telstra, to Mr Peter Leonard, Partner Gilbert and Tobin Lawyers, and to Mr John Stanton, CEO of Communications Alliance, and I think that's it. And of course to Mr Rod Tucker, who in opposition I had many conversations with respect to perhaps Victoria going it alone and doing fibre to the premise after the advent of the Abbott government. But that's not to be. Other infrastructure investment has taken priority. But we still hold up hope, and I think if that were to happen, Victoria would have had a great competitive advantage over other states in terms of in the innovation space. But at this stage, it looks like a pipe dream. Thank you for the invitation to launch the Melbourne Network Society Institute. As the Minister for Innovation, I am pleased to be able to launch and support an institute that will focus on the key driver of change in our society over the coming years, connectedness. I am looking forward to the exploration the MNSI will undertake, building on the ICT revolution that began in partnership with the Brumby government. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to launch this institute, given the previous Victorian Labor government's contribution of $5 million to the establishment of the Melbourne Network Society Institute's predecessor organisation, the Institute for a Broadband-Enabled Society. The university, government and industry partnership, which was formed through the IBES, led to strong support for interdisciplinary approach to research on broadband and its impact on the community. The MNSI has now been formed to build on that legacy, moving from a focus on universal access to broadband, to the challenges and opportunities that we face as a networked society, connecting people and sustaining that connection no matter where we live. The cross-sector collaboration that the MNSI was founded on aligns neatly with the Andrews Labor government's determination to build on our industrial strengths through ICT-based innovation. The importance of this institute should not be cannot be understated. The Andrews government recognises that our community is now digital and completely interconnected. The digital economy is a driver of technology and the underlying generator of productivity, growth and employment. Our rapidly networked society disrupts existing business models, drives productivity, creates jobs and supports new business opportunities. Already the Victorian ICT industry generates more than $35 billion in revenue annually and employs 91,300 Victorians in almost 8,200 companies. The Andrews Labor government is committed to supporting and building on this growth. Earlier this year, we announced our intention to develop a new ICT industry strategy to address widening demand for ICT products and services, access to ICT skills, and of most importance to this institute, infrastructure. This ICT strategy will recognise the industry's significance in supporting the Victorian economy and changing the way we do business. Ladies and gentlemen, I understand the great interest in this evening's theme, metadata in networked society. The discussion itself remains important and contemporary, given the passage of the Telecommunications Interception and Access Amendment, Data Retention Act 2015 and the funding measures in the 2015 federal budget. Given how interconnected our society is and the concerns about both security and privacy, this is a discussion that we really do need to have. I trust that this will be a fruitful debate, which I am pleased will take place using our Say platform. So, ladies and gentlemen, in conclusion, once again, thank you for the invitation this evening. Victoria's ICT sector has a strong future, and this new institute will help to drive new ideas and innovation. I look forward to learning more about the findings of its research and the ideas that it generates. I now officially open the Melbourne Networked Society Institute and wish all involved a productive and innovative future. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a really great pleasure to welcome you all again on behalf of the Institute to this forum. I would like to spend a few minutes before we get onto the forum to tell you a little bit about the Institute, but I will also acknowledge that the Minister able to spend some time with us, but has a busy engagement to go to, so I acknowledge that they have to leave. Thank you very much, Minister. As the Vice-Chancellor noted, the MNSI, or the Network Society Institute, marks the natural evolution from the research conducted at the Institute for Broadband-Enabled Society. It received generous support from this university, state government, and a range of industry partners. It was actually focusing on the research on the role, use, and the application of broadband technologies and services. And the developments, in the parallel development since then, have developed in networks and connectivity becoming the norm regardless of the method of delivery. Today, connectivity is becoming ubiquitous and society is transitioning towards a network society, as many industry and academia noted. Today, in other words, the society's key functions are influenced by the networking of every facet of our life, powered by the information and communication technologies. This transition presents many challenges as well as opportunities. Problems facing the network society are multifaceted and ideally suited for an interdisciplinary approach to trying to deal with some of them. So MNSI is developing an exciting research program trying to catalyze the interdisciplinary research effort across the university. It really seeks to examine how increased connectivity between people, places, and things can help solve some of the key societal problems. It is able to bring together a wide range of research expertise scattered throughout the university's comprehensive skill base located across a number of disciplines, schools, departments, and centers of excellence. It really takes advantage of our former institute's outstanding effort in bringing together a constellation of 200 plus interdisciplinary researchers in this space. So we are actually privileged to work with those existing research teams to take our research forward. It is actually, I would like to acknowledge at this time, the Network Society Institute is a key part of the family of interdisciplinary research institutes. I would like to pay tribute to outstanding research effort happening at other institutes focusing on neuroscience, energy, sustainable society, and social equity. The Network Society Institute actually look forward to having partnership initiative with the sister institutes as well. Our research is focusing around three main focus areas. The network living. It describes the key aspects of our living in a network's context. Research seeks to enhance the quality and sustainability of human life, supporting and enriching cultural and personal experiences. And this includes projects focused around precision and participatory medicine, and looking at diagnosis and management of conditions such as autism, for example, connecting people through technology to increase community cohesion, supporting independent living in an aging population, for example. Second theme is focused around networked economy. It actually examines the interaction between industry and government. It explores the disruptive business models and changes in the economy at all levels brought about by the networked technologies. MNSI also seeks to foster digital innovation, and we achieve this through engagement with government and industry partners in trying to explore how the technology improvements could actually make lasting impact on changing landscape in the digital economy. It also focuses on networked infrastructure, and it seeks to make out our cities and towns and regions better place to live and work. Connected sensors help us to gather vast amount of data, and we explore ways to use sensors and data to make cities become connected and smarter. We again seeking to partner with local governments and other agencies to provide benefits to the communities, to use the network and the connectivity to increase the service delivery, and also try and see whether we can address some of the gap between the community's needs and the community's resources in delivering or meeting those needs in the future. We recognize this research enterprise really needs an active partnership with organizations and communities. We actually look forward to those organizations who have identified challenges to seek inspiration for our research. We are also interested in working with the research partners to co-create solutions to society's key problems. We are trying to gear up the Institute by building research capacity. We're in the process of selecting number of projects from the university community proposed, trying to seed those activities through our seed funding initiative. It is also identifying a network of interdisciplinary champions as the Institute Fellows who will actually help us to drive the connections needed to try and network with the researchers from different disciplines and try and bring them together to form interdisciplinary research teams to tackle some of these issues in conjunction with our partners. It is also developing its infrastructure, the Connectivity Lab or C-Lab, which will provide the researchers a sandpit or digital sandpit environment to really try and accelerate the conversion of ideas into prototypes quickly. In this journey, we are privileged to have very experienced leaders. Some of them are here joining our advisory board. Without their wisdom, experience, and advice, it is very difficult for us to navigate this space. It's also, I would like to extend my appreciation of my executive committee, which is drawn from eminent leaders across the different disciplines of the university, and they provide me enormous support in setting up our interdisciplinary research agenda. We will release further information as we structure our research programs and projects in the next couple of months. This kind of brings me to the important the aspect of today. It's really the main event is the public forum on metadata. Tonight's event on metadata is a reflection of our approach to issues within the community. Too often, debates and problems end up being debated in a narrow and a partisan fashion. And as our society is very complex and our solutions to the problems really require careful analysis and balancing of different perspectives and demands. So tonight's forum actually tries to bring together three leaders, eminent in their own right, and to share their insight into this growing important topic of the use of metadata in the network society. So I'm extremely pleased to have the three prominent panelists, and they will be given 10 minutes to present their views initially, and then we will be able to support a moderated discussion at the end of that session. And to try and understand where the community is thinking on this important issue, we have partnered with our SAE to collect your kind of views and comments and questions, and use that to inform our panelists to shape their views and frame the discussion today. We also wish to create a conducive forum allowing panelists and the participants to share their views freely. We will endeavor to allow a quick Q&A immediately after the panelist presentation. So, and also important part, I would like to invite you all to join for refreshments at the end of the formal proceedings. With that, I would like to now introduce our panelist. Vish Nandal, Telstra. Vish Nandlal is the new Chief Technology Officer at Telstra. He is highly regarded as a telecom visionary and was recently named by Wireless World as one of the top 100 wireless wave makers globally. Prior to joining Telstra in June 2014, Vish was a CTO for Ericsson in North America. While at Ericsson, he was responsible for defining Ericsson's strategy and technology in virtual networking and in building connectivity solutions, establishing novel open innovation processes to drive business and future requirements in disruptive technology areas. We are also fortunate to have Peter Lennart, partner at Gilbert and Tobin Associates. Peter heads the Gilbert and Tobin's communications, media, and data protection practice. His primary focus is transactional structuring and regulation for technology, media, communications, and internet business corporations. Deal areas include data communications, communications and media infrastructure, platform and service arrangements, e-business, cloud, spectrum sharing, and outsourcing agreements. He also advises in relation to communications and e-payments regulations, privacy, interception, and data protection. He has particular expertise in cross-border deals and cross-border service delivery and acting for telecommunications and media operators throughout Southeast Asia. He is also the director of International Association of Privacy Professionals, Asia and New Zealand, IAP ANZ. We also, again, I would like to thank John Stanton, our third panelist, Chief Executive Officer, Communications Alliance. John is a seasoned communications and industry executive, well known to telecommunications industry professionals with more than 20 years of experience, who joined Communication Alliance as its CEO in early 2010. From 2006 to 2007, John was the CEO of People Telecom. Under his leadership, People Telecom became profitable and was recognized as Australia's best regional service provider in the Australian Telecom Awards 2007. In early 2009, the company was sold to M2 Telecommunications. With that introductions, I would like to now ask each of the panelists to make their case. Again, I remind each of you have 10 minutes, and then we will follow up with the Q&A. Let me welcome Vish Nandlal to the stage.
Great, thanks very much. It's always a bit of a risky proposition to put a CTO up in front of an audience because I'll probably take more than 10 minutes. But I'll try to keep to the brevity that was ascribed. Just prior to making some opening comments, I noted that a number of the questions on the online forum focused on data retention and privacy, and I view these as critical issues. Clearly we've got an accumulation of data that's going to raise questions around security, privacy, and law enforcement. Telstra has highlighted the challenges posed by the government's data retention policy and the expectations of privacy and cost. But at the same time, we're going to take our legal obligations seriously to assist law enforcement and national agencies very seriously. I don't want to really just focus on that one narrow aspect of law enforcement during the course of this discussion. I really wanted to explore some of the valuable aspects of data processing, big data analytics, and how it can contribute to the network society. And really one of the reasons I got into telecom was really to resolve some of those issues in terms of what I saw as a growing stream of data that was impacting our ability to really make progress from a social and a human perspective. I started off doing a lot of research in biomedicine and had colleagues in astrophysics. We used to operate what was called a sneaker net, which effectively meant that there was a bunch of researchers in lab coats who were carrying around solid-state disks between Berkeley and Columbia on their feet, on their sneakers. And it just seemed to me that there's got to be a better way in terms of managing the transfer of data back and forth between these 2 points. Kind of several years later, back in 2012, we were involved with the 10 million genome project. And if you tried to sequence 10 million genomes, you basically ended up in 2012 with around 20 exabytes of data that you needed to be able to store someplace. 20 exabytes of data was 4 exabytes more than the entire enterprise storage industry was producing that year. So it was a little disappointing that there was this one industry within nature that could completely exhaust an entire industry. As we kind of flash forward into 2015, there's a number of technologies that are out there that are here to help us harness and manage all that data. And the topical word is something called Hadoop, a set of systems that allow some distributed file systems to be engineered and to maintain at a controllable cost the way to store and access this data. That really is interesting from an engineering perspective, less interesting from someone who's sitting on the outside looking for outcomes of all this data. And as we take a look at what are some of the things you can do with massive data and following in the footsteps of some of the larger e-commerce players, advertising players like Google and Facebook, there is a whole new class of opportunity. And we've kind of looked at them in several circles in terms of how do you treat the data. Data itself is interesting to understand and really start to quantify where is data coming from and what data is important and what's not important. You can broadly classify data against data generated by people, so that would be all the data that you have in Facebook and Google and enterprise file systems. There's data generated by machines, which is several orders of magnitude larger than what's generated by people. That's a lot of what we've called metadata is generated by machines. This is where the Internet of Things obviously is taking root, and when you see sensor data providing really a digital dimension to our physical spaces, we're seeing an explosion in data in that realm. Probably the highest resolution of data is data in nature, and that's obviously in the realm of science and astrophysics. And how do we get high precision compute so that we can do better things from a medical perspective to advance causes both from society and humanity. When we look at some of the things that Telstra is interested as it relates to data, we're very focused on the operational data of our networks. And really that comes down to how can we do better preventative maintenance of the assets that we have in field? How can we do better fleet management so that our field force is best utilized so that we can serve the choice and products that we deliver to our customers? A lot of the work that we've done is geared very similarly across the rest of Australia in terms of what does enterprise need this data for? And a lot of it has to do with operational efficiency. How do we create a digital enterprise and extract all that data so that we can be more efficient in terms of how they deliver services? I think once you've created that digital map of your business, there is real opportunity to start to improve applications for the customer experience. And this is really how do we get our products and services to remove some of the frustration and pain points in the customer experience. And the third area, which is obviously very interesting, is the newer business models that can emerge. So once you find systems that interact with one another in unpredictable ways, you're able to start to understand how can I govern these systems in more intelligent ways that are more practical. And we've discovered a lot of these over the course of time. I think these applications themselves, while interesting, really are benefiting from advances in something called analytics. And analytics is really kind of scattered across 4 tent poles. The analytics that most people are kind of more aware of is descriptive analytics. And so most of the things that you'll see from a business intelligence perspective are really around what happened. And being able to understand what happened is obviously very important so that you can do something about it. I would say that most of the big data applications out there, 70% of them really are related to this very first tent pole in analytics. It's really the other ones that are becoming more important. And as you get more data and the ability to create full resolution of what you can do with descriptive analytics, you start to get into diagnostic capability. So why did something happen? You can move from there into predictive analytics, so you can start talking about what will happen. And then finally, what's going to be more interesting is the prescriptive side of analytics. So not just what will happen, but how can I analyze a set of choices to basically decide what am I going to do next. This is something that's obviously very important from a Telstra perspective as we take a look at how are we going to manage in an IoT world all the millions and millions of endpoints that are going to be connected into our network. Understanding what kind of choices we need to make so that I can be much more prescriptive in managing those resources so that I can effectively deliver services to our constituents is something that's obviously top of mind for us, an area of research and opportunity that we're targeting. As we go through all these pieces, it's really interesting to understand where these technologies are coming from. Technologies like big data, are emerging from a new place of open source, which is fairly new from a telecom perspective. Telecom's largely been underpinned by highly standardized platforms and applications. And as we take a look at, how are we going to really take the same type of robustness and resilience in big data and move it into an environment like Telstra, we're very interested in making sure that we can get a kernel of capability that's hardened. And to that end, we've been looking outside of just pure open source and into the industry to form alliances around how can we create something that can withstand the enterprise and the carrier grade capabilities that we need to provide mission critical services to our end users. And with that, we entered into a partnership with a number of other companies called the Open Data Platform Alliance, which was founded through Pivotal, but also involves IBM and General Electric and Verizon and other carriers as well. So we are very concerned about how do we protect privacy, security of our data systems. We invest a lot of money in terms of protecting that. We are obviously not in the habit of talking about what are those security measures. That usually exposes us to other nefarious agencies that may decide to try to breach. So we do invest a lot. We do a lot of research in this place. We've done a lot of preliminary research within CTO with companies and associations like NICTA, and we'll continue to make those types of investments. So with that, I will close off my comments and pass to my colleague, John. Or rather, okay, we didn't fit in order. No. Okay, it's a real big problem.
I'm going to go up to the podium just because I'm going to use a few slides. Those of you who see lawyers as rule-based engines, as we are, will no doubt be nervous when you hear that I've got slides because you'll think that they're going to be all full of words, and you'll be glad to hear that I think only 2 of my slides have words in them. I forgot to bring my other prop, which was an iPhone. And the reason that that was going to be my prop is that I think it has lived up to its promise. In 2007, when Steve Jobs launched this device, he said, "This will change everything." And that was a prescient statement because I think it has changed everything, generally for the better, and in one way in particular for the better, and that's really what I want to highlight today. Let me go forward one and then back. Of course, one way it's changed our life is the multitude of apps that are now available through a smartphone that affect all aspects of our life and make our life easier. They also make us much more capable of being tracked. They also present many problems to privacy of users. But what they have done, I think, is educate individuals about privacy. People have come to understand that there are many ways in which their smartphone is both a friend and a foe in terms of privacy management. And yes, many of us may say, well, individuals don't read privacy statements, they don't worry enough about individual privacy. Many of us who are parents are worried about our kids and the extent to which they share information, make available information about their movements and activities, apparently without regard to concerns about privacy. But I put it to you that this is all part of a process of education of us as individuals about life in the sensor society. And really we're very lucky in some ways that the first sensor device that we came to own and use has taught us a lot about the dangers of the sensor society and the kinds of issues that we need to address as we move into that society, and in particular manage privacy issues around that. Now, I often find that when lawyers start to talk about privacy, it looks pretty quickly like this, spaghetti. And really what I want to do today is just reduce the key issues of privacy law to a couple of key concepts that I think can really inform the discussion around the network society and how we address the privacy challenges of the network society. So what does that society look like? Well, in the home, this is what the OECD thought it looked like back at the beginning of 2013. And if you look closely at what they were predicting for 2017, you'll see that they were a bit conservative. Already many of us are using e-health devices, whether they're the iPhone 7 or the Fitbit or the Garmin device or whatever in our lives. And that's something that when you look at this table, looked a few years out. The key point to make is that very quickly we will be surrounded by many sensor-based devices, not only our iPhone. Of course, our iPhone is one of the most powerful of them all. Our iPhone, our smartphone, is one of the most powerful of them all, but many of these other sensor devices will very quickly catch up with them as well. And one of them, of course, is the connected car. And I love this slide. It's an extract from the telematic services agreement that you sign up when you buy your new Tesla car. And it governs the way in which information about your use of the car may be used by Tesla. And you'll see it grants some very broad rights to the vehicle manufacturer and supplier to analyse and use data gathered from your use of the vehicle. One thing I should say in passing, because I'm going to concentrate on privacy today, is that I actually think that privacy is, in some senses, a passing issue or an issue that we need to get on top of and then move on to the other, which I regard as more intractable issues of the new sensor-driven society, which are those around liability management, the use of data to discriminate between different sections of society and things like insurance and how we address those discrimination issues, and a whole host of other legal issues that arise out of the ability of manufacturers and suppliers of products and services to make much more targeted decisions around the way in which they price or make available their products and services. That's not just a privacy issue, that's an issue for us as a society in how we deal with the wealth of information that's becoming available. The other thing to say is that many of the benefits that are available to us from the sensor society have nothing whatever to do with personal information. If you read papers about the Internet of Things, they tend to focus very much upon uses of personal information and ways in which providers of products and services might spy on individuals. But in fact, many of the commercially valuable applications of data analytics that I've been involved in over the last few years have not been to do with use of personal data and provision of products and services at all. They've been to do with other applications of data analytics. And of course, your airline engine is but one of them. Airline engines today, turbines are replaced upon a fixed cycle based upon the life of the turbine. In the brave new world that we're going into, turbines will have sensor devices that will notify the manufacturer if and when there's stress fractures in the turbine, and the turbines might then be replaced other than on a straight time-based cycle. And that creates some real opportunities for huge savings in the costs of airport maintenance, potentially makes planes safer, and of course has nothing to do with uses of personal information at all. And of course, in this brave new world, there's the sexiest person of all, the data scientist. Whoever would have thought that mathematicians would become sexy, and that the lawyers who always used to think of themselves as sexy became last millennium's leftovers, which is why I now describe myself as a rules-based engine. I'm getting all ready for the 21st century, only 14 years too late. So, personal information. Let me just spend a couple of minutes and then I'll finish talking about the concept of personal information and how it fits together with this new sense of society. One of my key propositions, and I'm sort of a contrarian on this, is that privacy law in Australia is not broken. And in fact, I actually think our privacy law on the whole is fit for purpose for the new world that we're going into. And the reason that I think that is that at the heart of Australian privacy law is a distinction between the regulation of personal information, which is information about an individual who is identified or is reasonably identifiable, and non-regulation from a privacy viewpoint of other information. And if we, for the moment, treat the discussion around metadata as potentially including both categories, we need to be very clear as to how that distinction is to be drawn. And one of the things that people easily get lost in talking about privacy in Australia is how to work out what information is personally identifying or enables an individual to be identifiable and which information does not. And it's an absolutely critical concept for most businesses because many businesses that want to go into the business of complex data analytics need to firstly work out whether their analytics will be of personal information and therefore requires notice and consent to the person concerned. And secondly, whether the analytics can be conducted using de-identified information that is persistently and reliably de-identified so that no individual could be re-identified from that information. And our privacy law encourages businesses to think carefully about this in two ways. Firstly, we have a concept called data use minimisation, has various names, or the data limitation principle. But the key concept is that businesses should use personal information only for the purposes for which it was collected, that they've notified to an individual, or in the case of sensitive information, that they've obtained the individual's consent for that use. And then the law says, well, okay, if you de-identify that information in such a way that no individual can be re-identified, you fall out of that regulatory framework. Now, of course, the problem is how you work out whether de-identification has become sufficiently reliable that you fall out of the highly regulated environment that applies to personal information and into the effectively unregulated environment that applies to de-identified information. And this is critically important when you, for example, release data sets into the public arena, because there any motivated intruder, as information commissioners call them, can try to work out who the individuals were within the data set that has been released. So one of the big changes that's happened really in the last 3 years has been lawyers and data scientists and researchers engaging in a dialogue around really a development of a risk management framework and risk assessment framework around working out when personal information is sufficiently de-identified. It's a fundamentally different dialogue to the dialogues that lawyers normally have, because lawyers normally talk about concepts like reasonable man, what is reasonable and what isn't, a normative concept that really you can't apply mathematics to at all. But when you get into the issue of whether information has been sufficiently de-identified, that the risk of re-identification has been adequately managed, that in essence requires some kind of quantitative assessment methodology for working out when the risk has been sufficiently reduced. And there's been some very interesting work in that area in the last couple of years that is now informing privacy law in all major jurisdictions. Now, we can get to it in the questions, but one of the key points to make is that now there are ways of thinking about de-identification in a scientific, rigorous way that enable us to move beyond the kind of vague and amorphous concepts of reasonableness that traditionally have been at the heart of privacy law. And I think privacy law is up to that challenge. I think that privacy law can be made to work in the 21st century through applying analytical concepts, analytical risk management frameworks, risk assessment methodologies to managing of privacy risk. They were really the key points that I wanted to make today. I just put this diagram up because I think it's a really nifty picture. Just to say that when we think about re-identification risk, we are inherently talking about risk management and the risk of re-identification. And that is a completely different discussion to that most privacy advocates put forward, which is either it's personal information, ergo regulated, it's non-identified information, ergo not regulated, but not giving you any way to work out when you cross the Rubicon. And crossing the Rubicon is the key aspect that we need to reduce to mathematics and certainty to enable data analytics to unlock the benefits of a sensor society. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for allowing me to be part of the discussion this evening. Taz, congratulations on the birth or the rebirth of the Institute. I think it's a very happy event. I'll get my criticism out of the way up front. I find it somewhat insensitive that you would put the word metadata into the title of this evening's proceedings, because as somebody who has been heavily involved in the development and the debate around whether to have a data retention regime in Australia on a mandatory basis, and the refinement of the legislation, I use that term pretty loosely, and now the implementation of the data retention regime. That word has caused me an enormous amount of pain and anguish. And despite being cruelly reminded of it this evening, I'll try to soldier on. Echoing, I guess, the observations that Vish made, certainly Comms Alliance, and I'll explain who we are very briefly. We are the industry association for the telecommunications sector. So all of the major service providers, the vendors, content providers, search engines, law firms, and other players in the industry tend to be members of Comms Alliance. We run the co-regulatory standards and codes and guidelines, technical interoperator, consumer protection by which the industry operates. We advocate for the sector, do our share of engagement with politicians and regulators and others, and try to forge industry consensus views on the key issues that confront the sector. And we at Comms Alliance and our membership certainly agree that metadata, the Internet of Things and big data analytics are key building blocks for the development of the network society. We think they're tools that will enable us to better understand our environment, to make moves to manage our lifestyle and elements of that environment, to understand the cross-sectoral connections that we might not otherwise be able to discern, and to create value for business and for individuals. And that recognition was a large part of our recent decision to create an Internet of Things think tank within Communications Alliance, designed to create a globally aware and activated IoT community in Australia that can have a direct input into government policy making via a national industry viewpoint. We had the first meeting of the think tank executive council just last week, and the people on this group and around the table read like a who's who of some of the stars of the global tech world. We have at the table Intel, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, Alcatel-Lucent, Telstra, Ericsson, Huawei, KPMG, Rosetta Technology, and importantly, the Bureau of Communications Research, which has recently been established within the Federal Department of Communications, and which is a key input body to the development of government policy in this sector in coming years. And we think this is important because despite many of the very good things that are going on in Australia around the network society and the Internet of Things, we really don't think Australia is at the forefront of the game right now, and we have some catching up to do, particularly if we are going to harness the opportunities that are inherent in the accelerating growth curve of the Internet of Things and avoid some of the risks, or hopefully all of the risks, that are also inherent in the growth of that phenomenon. The Executive Council of the think tank has commissioned an initial study to be undertaken over the next few months. Some of the things that we'll look at will be firstly a regulatory stream to try and make sure that the regulatory framework in Australia is equipped to cope with the very different types of challenges that the Internet of Things is going to throw at it, and that it can act as an enabler for the development of the Internet of Things in Australia rather than an inhibitor. I mean, just by way of a couple of very many examples, I mean, if we are going to connect even 1 billion new devices in Australia, and many of those are operating via wireless networks, we probably don't have enough numbers to create the SIMs that are going to be needed to power those. Maybe they should have a 14-digit number, given that nobody's going to ring them. But practical aspects like the ability of the numbering plan to cope with this development need to be looked at early rather than in a state of crisis a little way down the track. Similarly, if these devices are scattered across the nation and indeed across the world, maybe there needs to be a reconstruct of some elements of global roaming arrangements so that we don't cripple these global networks with commercial constructs designed for a different environment. We also want this study in the early part of its work to map out the Internet of Things and digital service ecosystem in Australia, which we all understand is complex, is codependent, has many stakeholders to it, but nobody's really mapped it out properly. And I think just doing that will help us to understand some of the areas that we need to focus on. The study will also look at areas where we hope Australia can develop global expertise and potentially export opportunities. These might be in areas such as agribusiness, but they could equally be related to some of the somewhat less sexy but very important underlying prerequisites. Things like energy efficiency. I'm told that the global internet today consumes enough power to place it in an equivalent category to the top 5 energy consuming nations in the world. And I think on that note, it's very pleasing to see that right here at Melbourne University, Alcatel-Lucent and Bell Labs have invested in the Centre for Energy Efficient Telecommunications, and they're doing some very important work to better understand how to capture and measure energy usage, how to engineer networks to ensure that all of the gains we might make from efficiency and innovation through the Internet of Things aren't sort of consumed by the equivalent increase in energy costs. So those areas are important. Equally, there are other elements of commercial constructs that may need to be looked at. For example, we are probably going to need a commercial offering that is tailored to connecting millions of interconnected devices that are iterative in their communications, but which require only low bit rates to operate. And if you think about that, that's sort of exactly the opposite of the task that NBN has been charged with achieving since its birth. So, we may need new offerings and new ways of doing business to ensure that we can harness the power of the Internet of Things. The brief for tonight talked a bit about risks, and I guess there are risks inherent. We've had some discussion tonight about the risk that all metadata on individuals is regarded as personal information, and that certainly would be problematic if it were to be the case. And with the recent Privacy Commissioner view is not one that we share in that regard. There is, of course, a range of different security risks. In any new industry development, there will be those who will look to benefit from fraud. If you were able to contact 1 million devices and get them to start hitting your website, the power of that click fraud to generate revenue for you is probably quite considerable. There may be other attacks. There are risks that if critical services are interrupted, the ramifications will be significant. If I'm relying on the Internet of Things for my collision avoidance in my motor vehicle, I'd really prefer that it not switch off without me knowing about it. There's also a risk around scope creep in the data retention legislation that's been put in place. There is a data set. We are working now with government to better define what that data set actually means in practical operation. And one of the things that we're doing through a working group at Communications Alliance is taking the 13 most commonly offered communication services in Australia and actually mapping out every element of data component that needs to be retained for each service. And this is important because there are more than 400 service providers in Australia. Many of them are small businesses, and more than 300 of them share 1% of total market share. And it's quite a daunting prospect for them to have to try and figure out how to comply with this regime. So hopefully by putting this matrix together, agreeing it with government that yes, this is what needs to be retained, we make it possible for smaller providers to effectively download the services that they're using and understand exactly what they've got to keep. And we also guard against scope creep from the agencies in coming years, where there's always a risk that they'll sort of reinterpret what they need to be a broader set of information. So hopefully that tool will help guard against that. Finally, Taz, the Internet of Things project is off and running with a great team of people working on it, and we don't know exactly where the journey will take us, but we think it's an important step to try and create a national industry view on these issues. I genuinely hope that there will be an opportunity for us to work with the Institute. I think you could bring a lot of value to us, and I think the interaction could be very useful for both entities. So I hope we can cooperate a little on that front. Thank you very much for your time and attention, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, panelists, for a very detailed and a broad-ranging view. Let me open it for question and answers if there is any burning question. There's one.
Peter, I'm a data scientist. I'm on the bottom quartile of sexy, though. Up on your slide, you mentioned no privacy risk on the right-hand side. I don't remember the exact words, but I would just challenge that thought, because obviously when there's a lot of people in one location, privacy is not so much of an issue, but in Telstra or in our networks, we have communications facilities where there's only a few people, and I still think there's probably a privacy risk there. I may have understood what you were saying, but yeah, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah. I was on mute before. I'm mic now, am I? Yep. Okay. Well, there's the Internet of Things for you. I was, indeed, I was saying perhaps just the opposite. What I was endeavouring to say is that to completely eliminate the risk of re-identification of individuals is an impossible task in many commercial applications of data analytics. And the question then becomes just how low or remote a risk of re-identification do you need to be able to achieve, and in what circumstances do you take into account either the nature of the data or the audience that might potentially see that data. And to give you an example, if you're putting a medical data set into the public arena where any motivated intruder can do their best to re-identify, clearly there is a much more significant privacy risk than if you give a data set to a trusted third party who is subject to safeguards around the way in which that information can be used. So let's say you hash and salt identifiers, give it to a third party to work on the information with hashed and salted identifiers, and they never get access to the decryption key that enables individuals to be re-identified, and they're under contractual limitations about the use of that information that effectively means the data set can never leave a controlled and secured environment in which they work. So in that world, your assessment of privacy risk might be completely different to the data set that goes out into the public arena. And there was a fascinating example, in fact, the UK Health Department was looking at just this issue. Let me just quickly read a paragraph from this because I think it's a really interesting analysis. Specific cases can be high threat. The likely sensitivity of the data can be an indicator of high threat in some cases. Information on termination of pregnancies in leads is particularly sensitive and of interest to certain people, and thus more likely to be a target for re-identification than information about hip operations in leads. Information published by a hospital that might reveal the reason that a celebrity was admitted to hospital might have a commercial value. Some people might be motivated by the status gained in penetrating certain targets that ought to be particularly secure, such as the medical records of high security prisoners or a national register of sex offenders. A man seeking his ex-wife and children may be particularly motivated to discover their address in a woman's refuge in Sheffield. Thus, certain people are going to be motivated to try and re-identify individuals within a data set if the nature of the data is of particular interest or value to them, or if successful re-identification offers a certain status. So you need to look in a multifaceted way. Who's going to see the information? What the level of threat that's associated with that information, the motivation of various peoples to try and re-identify individuals, and so on. And all of that requires a sophisticated risk management assessment and methodology. So my point was that that is becoming part of privacy law and thinking now in Australia and other countries. And that is really a recognition that it is impossible to reduce re-identification risk to zero in many cases.
If John or Vish, if you want to add anything.
I certainly don't.
I have a question to John. This is about the new federal laws on data retention. Today, the majority, I believe, of internet sessions are human to machine or maybe human to human. In this new world of the Internet of Things, that communication is going to be overwhelmed by machine-to-machine communications. Your members that are concerned about the amount of data they've got to retain, is this going to be an issue when there's going to be just zillions of messages from refrigerators telling the local supermarket that the milk needs replacing, or that the alarm in the garage has gone off. I can imagine there'll be orders of magnitude more data on the network than there is at the moment, at least sessions, short sessions, maybe not more data, but more short sessions of information transfer. Is this going to blow out the amount of data that's that needs to be retained?
Unless we can control it, absolutely, yeah. It's a tsunami of additional metadata. The legislation does provide for an exemptions regime. And one of the important things about streamlining the compliance costs with this regime will be about how well that exemptions regime is used. At the moment, it's set up to be a case-by-case exemption where you put in your implementation plan as a service provider to the information authority, and you say, well, I'd like to exempt this because I don't think it's of relevance to law enforcement or national security agencies, and the CAC agrees with you or not. And that decision is confidential. Now, we don't think that's particularly efficient. We would like to see as many cases of class exemptions declared up front, so that we're not forced to go through that bespoke process, and also we've got upfront certainty for service providers. IPTV is a great example. It generates a vast amount of metadata, which logically you would say is of no interest to law enforcement agencies. And the government sort of almost got there on that front. They said, well, broadcast services are exempt. And we initially thought, oh, well, that's great, IPTV's out. But of course, if you look at the Broadcasting Services Act and at the definition of broadcast services, it doesn't include services which are delivered on demand. And I don't know of any IPTV, service that's going to stream 20 channels simultaneously, nor a broadband connection that's going to handle them. So I think equally for IPTV and for machine-to-machine applications or communications that are demonstrably not a national security or law enforcement issue, we need a cooperative approach with government to exempt those and exempt them across the board.
Hello, my question's for Peter Leonard. You're the lawyer, so I'm going to ask you about liability. My question is, what's the legal situation if the metadata information being so carefully retained by the telcos leaks, either deliberately through hackers or accidentally through mistakes? You've already alluded to the possibility that that could be very interesting for a variety of people with all sorts of nasty motivations. Who bears the legal responsibility in the case of that data accidentally getting into the wrong hands?
So this new legislation, which was not as carefully thought through and as well drafted as one would hope for a piece of legislation that is the most draconian legislation of its type in the Western world, tries to take a shorthand approach on this issue by saying two things. Firstly, the service provider is required to encrypt all of the data that is retained solely for the purpose of meeting the data retention requirements. And secondly, it deems all of the data that is retained solely for the purpose of meeting the government's obligations, the obligations to government, to be personal information, even though most of it won't be, and therefore become subject to the obligation under the Privacy Act for somebody who's collecting personal information to take reasonable steps to protect the security of that information from, amongst other things, unauthorised intrusions, including hacking. So then the question becomes, well, what are reasonable steps? And in essence, the law says, well, that depends upon what the available technologies of the day are. And there is now quite a body of law around that. Optus recently had trouble with an intrusion that led to an enforceable undertaking being given to the Privacy Commissioner, and tells us a bit about what restrictions, what requirements might be appropriate in that circumstance. So the short answer is that there will be an obligation to take reasonable steps to protect that information. It has to be encrypted, and the reasonable steps is a sort of dynamic concept that looks at the nature of threats from time to time. But all of this comes back to the point of the cost of implementation of this framework and how much of that cost is borne by the government and how much is passed on to service providers, and then ultimately the cost of provision of services, which of course may have a differential impact between larger service providers and smaller service providers. And that's where the work of John's Communications Alliance is particularly important.
If I can just follow on from that, Peter, we are in discussion with AGD about how we put some meat around the bones of the encryption requirement within the bill, because we did provide information to the Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security about the fact that not every system in existence today, particularly the older legacy systems, are actually suitable for encryption. So just a blanket requirement that everything should be encrypted is a fairly sort of blunt piece of the legislation. So we're trying to flesh that out. We're also trying to guard against a flagged amendment that Labor has said it will put up when another piece of legislation comes before the House later this year, to require that all of the retained data be stored in Australia, because that somehow makes it inherently more secure. We obviously don't sort of necessarily agree that follows.
Well,
back to our lawyer.
Australian privacy law follows it wherever it goes, in essence, in that the person that collects that information is responsible for its safekeeping, whether it's in Australia or elsewhere. So in that sense, Australian privacy law can reach wherever the information is.
Sorry.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. I'm afraid, Peter, this might be one that you end up answering again. So I'm Peter Francis from the Public Record Office. The line between identifiable data and personal information, as you say, I think is quite easily blurred. But there's clearly a legitimate role to use both as well. For instance, de-identifiable data to find identify cancer hotspots in regions and that kind of thing, which needs you to have an awful lot of data across a whole range of sources to create a picture, to find patterns. Equally, fraud detection, which needs identifiable personal information across a range of different data sources as well. One of the problems is, in practicality, is that the systems that enable you to do a lot of the matching also make re-identification a much simpler, or at least a more doable activity. It then comes to the life of the data, because de-identifiable data in a big cube is perpetual, and that's its value, is it's longitudinal. So the more you get, the greater the value. Personal information and the like has a legal life, and we're all aware that some records we keep need to be kept for a certain period of time, maybe 10 years or whatever. But the flip side of that same coin is that you're actually obliged to destroy them at that point. Now, if you can destroy the identifiable version if you like, but should we pretend that the de-identifiable version is still discoverable? So from a forensic legal point of view, you cover yourself by destroying an identifiable record, but if in fact you're also holding it in a re-identifiable form, it should be discoverable in a Royal Commission even, or if any other legitimate legal pursuit. Thank you.
Yeah, so privacy law obliges a collector and holder of personal information to destroy it when it's no longer required for its primary purpose, or no longer required under records retention requirements, as you know. And so theoretically at least, the obligation at the end of that period is either to destroy or de-identify. And in fact, most organisations don't de-identify. Organisations squirrel away data as personal data and generally don't observe the requirement to destroy or de-identify. It's a very common problem nowadays. I think that generally application of a de-identification risk methodology will enable sensible decisions to be made around destruction cycles, and this is just an aspect really of risk management, of information that organisations need to get up to speed on now and change existing practices. Just on the standard for de-identification, there's now development of standards internationally around that. There's work in the US at the moment on a NIST standard on what an acceptable level of de-identification is. And in the US, there's been a lot of work on this under their so-called Health Information Portability and Accountability. I've forgotten what it stands for. It's HIPAA, anyway, their so-called HIPAA legislation. And the safe harbour rule there seems to allow for a re-identification probability of about 1.5%. So if it's below 1.5%, it's okay. If it's above 1.5%, not okay. And so we're now starting to get to quite mathematically based assessments of what level of risk is appropriate, and whether it's 1.5% or something else, I'm not qualified to express a view on, but I think that it is a sign that the law and mathematics and probability analysis are inextricably linked and converging.
Hi, my question is to do with participatory sensing, Internet of Things. And we're seeing an explosive world of billions of devices connected to the network. And these devices are with people. It's more like 2 or 3 devices per person. That's the kind of trend we're seeing. So with this, one side, we talked about data retention, privacy, and security. Another side, there are a number of countries moving to open data platforms where we can really exploit this particular technology by companies, et cetera, for community benefit. When we do this, there's a couple of issues. One, we need to have some kind of data, privacy-preserving data mining kind of techniques that you explained in the data analytics sections. In the other sense, you have data incest problem where you have multiple duplicate data coming through, or intruders flooding the open data platform with lots of data, which is basically upsetting the whole system. So I'm just wondering what your views are for this industry to move forward.
So I guess the question was, in an open data platform world where I'm landing multiple different sources of data, what is the vulnerability of attack for that? Clearly I think this is an interesting concept. I mean, Telstra is an intermediary in many cases when it comes to machine-to-machine data. We don't actually host the applications. These are typically just connections that we maintain, and third-party industries actually will offer an application either as a software platform that sits in an Amazon cloud or in a private cloud of some form. And so now it's a question of what type of security do they offer? And I think we've covered off some of the discussion around what kind of security principles that need to be applied, what's reasonable, and how can that data be breached and then identified. So I think you're coming back down to similar concepts in terms of what kind of protections need to be in place to manage that. I'd say that there is some really great technologies that are emerging. And I do know of some implementations where, if the issue around privacy breaches is really one of security at the end of the day, there's several ways to manage that. One is some quantum-resistant cryptography that's incoming, homomorphic encryption, where you actually don't need to dekey the encrypted data. You can actually do mathematical analyses with that data in encrypted form, which actually reduces the possibility of that data being discovered. And probably the third and more important one is that, in an Internet of Things world, it becomes less and less an issue, I think, of encryption of data and more one of data integrity. And so when you take a look at things like KSI systems or distributed trust authorities that are able to detect at machine time any type of data breach or data integrity type of attack, you can actually fairly quickly remediate that issue. And so I think that there's a host of technologies that are coming to address those outside and inside of Internet of Things type application platforms that are going to help to prevent some of those types of issues and attacks.
Okay. David Swan, I'm a journalist with Technology Spectator. There was a journalist, Ben Grubb, recently who was awarded access to his own metadata from Telstra. I'm wondering if the panel thinks, do people have a right to their own metadata? And if no, why not?
I can start. Telstra in particular, we are one of the only telcos in Australia that run a metadata access system, so customers can request their personal data. And clearly the recent ruling by the Privacy Commission extended the obligation by declaring that all metadata is now something that is personal. And obviously I think over the course of today we've made some discussion about what's reasonable in terms of what should be considered personal metadata. And I think it's really that gray space relative to how do you govern that, that we're actually in some amount of dispute. So we've made an appeal to the Administrators Appeals Tribunal to clarify that kind of obligation. Clearly Telstra's position right now is that that is not reasonable.
Yeah, and certainly that's a view that Comms Alliance has shared publicly, that if a person wants access to their metadata, then there ought to be the provision for cost recovery by service providers of what it costs to collate and provide that information. And certainly the ruling in the recent case was that a much broader set of data, including network data, which is it doesn't tell the recipient anything about themselves or their behaviour, was included in the mix, and that's actually a broader data set than is available to the law enforcement agencies today. So if the principle of all of that data being classified as personal information and having to be provided by service providers free of charge was to become the norm, then not only would that be enormously disruptive for the service provider community, not of great value to the recipients, but also would only be a matter of time before law enforcement agencies said, well, we'd like that broader set of information as well. So we think there are some real risks in the decision as it was formulated, and I think it'll be helpful if it is clarified by the AAT.
A couple of quick questions, please. I think we're running out.
It's Tim Holborn speaking. I guess I was going to ask that question before, and I was going to note that Tim Berners-Lee, in one of his speeches, said that my data is valuable to you, but it is more valuable to me. And then within that, there's, I guess one of the other areas is that data doesn't appear to be covered by the Copyright Act. And so whilst privacy is very important, I also question whether or not the broader data rights concept, which may include sovereignty of choice of law, reuse, whether it's encrypted, much broader than simply privacy. Has any consideration been put around that, in addition to providing customers access to their own data?
So your question started, I think, with the concept of my data, which you have to unpack and then say, do you regard it as my data because it is data about you, or because you regard it as commercially valuable and therefore something that you should control the derivation of commercial value from it.
Talking more about citizenship.
Citizenship.
There's asymmetrical access and there's mutual access. So we sign a contract, for example, it will be expected I have a copy of that contract. Whereas digitally, I think perhaps there's other rights issue.
Yeah, so, and this is where we start to move beyond privacy law to issues of, what you might regard as asymmetry in bargaining power, in how so we could be here a very long time. But really, I guess I'm highlighting that there's, as you start to pull apart issues like this, you discover issues around unconscionability, consumer contracts, whether privacy terms have been adequately brought to your attention, whether if you choose not to read privacy terms, like most of us choose not to read because there's too many of them to read, we should be bound by what you've not read. And I think that a good starting point to sort of make this manageable is to really ask the question of what should we be concerned about as citizens in relation to the way in which information is collected about us and used. And that's where I keep coming back to this distinction between personal information and de-identification. And because I start from the proposition that if it is effectively de-identified, then I don't think the consumer should still control the derivation of economic value from that de-identified data. But that is of itself a contestable proposition, I recognise. And if you say, well, this is all about value and I want to control how value is derived out of any information that is some way derived from personal information because I regard personal information as mine and not somebody else's, then you end up at a different policy outcome. So I think there's a lot of difficult policy, social issues in there that we've got to unpack. And, they all come to the fore in things like insurance pricing and the extent to which, for example, de-identified information might be used for individually targeted insurance pricing or better customer segmentation for pricing of insurance products. And that is an issue that we're going to have to look at in the next few years, particularly as people understand more about their genetic profile and may, as a result of that, be required to make disclosures to their insurers about genetic predispositions to certain diseases. We have no protection in this country of individuals' knowledge about their genetic information. In the US and some other countries, there's legislation that specifically address that, for example, in the health insurance area. So you're not obliged to divulge what you know about predisposition to particular diseases to a prospective health insurer. Of course, that hasn't been an issue in Australia because we've got universal healthcare, universal health insurance. But as soon as that starts to fragment, this will become a real issue.
I'm sorry, if you can make it a very quick question.
Okay.
That's the
That was
last
actually
one.
a very neat segue into my question, which is about social policy. I was just wondering if any of you could comment, as we're becoming increasingly reliant on data analysis to inform social policy, what's being done to identify where the gaps are, particularly thinking about data inequality here, and will the marginalised parts of our community that aren't part of the Internet of Things be missed in that analysis?
It's a good question.
That's not a quick answer.
I'm not really qualified to answer it, but I resonate with the feeling behind the question that there there will continue to be a risk that there is effectively a digital divide even in Australia, and that those who don't generate data or participate in communication networks in the same way as others may potentially miss out on the benefits that can flow from meaningful and helpful analysis of those data. You would hope that that when that occurs, a certain amount of extrapolation will happen, such that the policy remedies or decisions will also benefit those who haven't directly fed the analysis. But I think that's one of those areas where we really don't know the answers, and I'm glad that there will be those around who will keep bringing those issues to the fore and making sure that in any policy considerations that flow from this, we do take account of the risk if that's not considered. I'm sure.
Is it the right expression, the best antiseptic is daylight? Anyway, whatever that expression is, I actually think this is about government open data, amongst other things, and the best thing we can do to reduce the digital divide is to put as much government data into the public arena as we possibly can. And I think that in Australia we have been woefully slow in forcing government to disgorge data into the open, and we've allowed nefarious claims of privacy to be used, or that it's too hard, or etc. And if you want an example of what we should be doing, just look to the UK, where both under Labor governments and Conservative governments, there's been a concerted effort to put open data into the public arena to enable researchers such as this institute to get their hands on the data, to make the policy recommendations, do the analysis that will address the digital divide.
Thank you. I think I'm sorry all good discussions have to come to an end, and I think we're going to have the panelists staying around. We're going to have the drinks outside, so you would be able to ask some more questions if they're able to answer some of you. I know some of you are still dying to ask questions. At this stage, I would like to thank the panelists, a token of appreciation for contributing to the important debate today. And I also, at the same time, let me extend my thanks to my colleagues, Adem, Lourdes, Ken Clark, Chamil Jayasundara, and Zahir, as well as Katrina Franks, who helped us to get the event organized. And please join us outside for a drinks and for refreshments. Thank you.